Today, I'm going to show you how to turn a 3D model into a handheld physical prop in just one easy step. Here we go. Ta-da! Hey there, fellow maker. Bill here. Welcome to the shop. Today, I'm making Tom Cruise's pistol from the movie Oblivion, and I figured this would be a really great chance to show off a little bit of 3D modeling, kind of whet your appetite a bit. Now, this was a project for the PropTarts Secret Santa. If you haven't joined the PropTarts Group already, we'll have a link down below. But every year they do a Secret Santa. This year, my giftee wanted something from the movie Oblivion, and I was happy to oblige. So to get started here, I'm going to crack open Fusion 360, grab my reference material, and give you a very quick rundown on the 3D modeling process. It's about 3 minutes long. It'll get you started really fast. The software is free. So why don't we jump in and learn a little bit about 3D modeling, and then we'll turn it into a prop. All right, let's go. The first thing I did was to gather some reference images. It was hard to get all of the angles, so I grabbed some fan-made props and I grabbed some screen-used images and did the best I could. I'll try and link to these down in the description. Next, I started a new project in Fusion 360, and with an image I put together of all of my reference images, I added an attached canvas with those reference images, and I calibrated the scale of it using a ruler that I had put in that image. After that, I started a sketch to work on the side view. I traced the relevant features over my reference image. Features like the top and bottom of the gun and the bevels, as well as the top, bottom, and center of the barrel. Then I started a sketch on the front view using the points from that first sketch as reference. Then I drew the outline of the barrel and the gun body around it using just normal lines, the mirror command, and some fillets. This finished line was then offset inwards to create a cavity for that barrel. I extruded all of these profiles to create the bulk form for most of the gun body. Then I started another sketch to draw all of the main side profile details. Some of those were extruded directly through the main body to cut them out completely, and some of them were surface details that didn't quite go all the way through and were added later. Then the barrel was extruded as a new body, and I did the same thing with the profile we drew to make room for the barrel. With a new sketch and another extrude, I cut the back off of this new body, and then I used the combine command to cut this out of the main gun body, creating that front cavity. I also used the barrel to cut out a cavity through the gun body, and then I created a new barrel by drawing a cylinder in that cavity, and I just made sure it was a new body and it wasn't joined to the gun body, and the diameter was slightly smaller than that of the cavity by about 0.2 millimeters. Then I created another cylinder to punch a hole in the front of the barrel, you know, that part where the bullets should come out. On the barrel, I drew and extruded the little sight. Then I used it to cut out a spot on the barrel for it to be attached. Then I used a cylinder to cut a hole through both the barrel and the gun body so that I could add a metal rod later on to make the prop more durable and add a little bit of weight. The handle's modeled separately, starting by drawing a sketch of the profile from the top, perpendicular to the length of the handle. That profile was extruded a bit longer than necessary, and then I trimmed off the bottom. I used the cutoff plane to create an offset plane so that I could draw a sketch for the very bottom of the handle. Those two profiles were then connected using a loft. Before connecting the handle to the gun body, I trimmed off the rear portion of the main gun body with an extrusion, and then I rotated the handle into place. I used a plane to cut off the extra portion at the top. That extra body can then be hidden or removed. A bit more mass was added to the back part of the handle, and then I combined it with the rest of the gun body, and I used the original side profile to cut out the trigger well. All of the same previous techniques were then used and repeated to create all of the rest of the parts of the gun and all the little details on the side. Finally, to create some panel lines, I drew a sketch and then used that to cut the bodies into two pieces. Then the mating edges were chamfered before combining them back together, leaving a nice groove. As many parts as possible were modeled separately from the main gun body so that they could be printed separately and painted separately. That was a brief rundown of the 3D modeling, kind of skated over a lot of the fine details. If you want a deep dive into modeling this one, I have a 30-minute long edit of the modeling process. Shows you absolutely everything. You can go check that out. But for now, well, I went and printed all my parts. These were all done on my Ultimaker 2 Plus Extended using ABS filament. I prefer ABS because it sands a lot easier than PLA. I didn't really mess with the settings all that much. It was just in Cura. I think it was like 0.12 millimeter layer height. Other than that, fairly default settings. And this is what we have. I gotta tell you, I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. There's one other thing I did. This body part was one large piece, so I cut it in two just to make it easier to print. I also ran out of filament when I was printing at one point. So I came in the next day and it was printing in midair up there. So be sure to check your filament before you leave something printing all night. So the first thing we need to do is take all these supports off. And then we're gonna do a whole bunch of sanding. Now for prints like this, sometimes supports just are necessary if you're gonna have big overhangs. It means a little bit of extra cleanup later on, but these prints came out really nice. So I'm a big fan of supports whenever necessary. I printed everything with brims, so it's this extra bit of material that helps it stay stuck down to the build plate. I find that's usually necessary when printing with ABS, and then I gotta go in and trim it off. It's not that big of a hassle. It's totally worth doing if you're having trouble with your print sticking down. So I'm just liberating these. I'm being as careful as possible, but I'm gonna come back in with sandpaper to clean it up a little bit, like that. The flash, this stuff that you could just throw away, I'll actually save this and mix it with acetone into a slurry that I then brush on the bed of my printer to keep prints to stick down. So I'll hang on to this. Now, a lot of these little detail parts here I could have printed along with the body. So for example, this switch here is going to eventually fit right in there. But this surface is going to be easier to sand without a switch in the way. And all the edges on this switch are going to be easier to sand with it not stuck in the body. So I prefer, when I can, to print pieces separately, like the trigger will eventually go in there, but it's much easier to work on it when it's separate. It's also easier to paint it, especially if it's different colors. So I can paint this separately without having to mask it and then glue it on. This surface here was touching the build plate, that's why it's so shiny. I do actually want to sand all that. There's also a little bit of a burr on the edge where it touched down, so I'm just going over with my needle file to round that over a tiny bit. You could use a deburring tool, but that tends to leave a little bit of a chamfer, and I don't want that for this one, so I'm going a little more surgical with my needle file here to round that over, and then I'll go with my sandpaper and start cleaning that up. These larger pieces had all the support material and it's time to take that off. I just used the default settings in Cura for the supports. I know that it can be done better and other slicing software might handle it differently or better, but I'm gonna just dive in and see what I can do. I usually just use a pair of needle nose pliers and I'll go in and pull off what I can by hand, but if I have to reach in to spots, I can go in with my pliers and start extracting everything. I've started to clean my parts up a little bit. There was a lot of support material on the inside of this where the barrel needs to go. And this is gonna get painted and then added. So I wanna make sure that once it's painted, it'll fit nicely. And right now it's a little snug. So I'm gonna wanna sand inside there. And of course I'll sand the outside of my barrel. Now I noticed something, and this is common with 3D printing. This was how it printed, coming up this way. The bottom layers, even though I trimmed that little bit of flash off the bottom, it still ballooned out a very slight amount. So if I sand this, my sand stick here is missing part because this part here is just a slightly wider diameter. So to make sure it fits in there nicely, I'm gonna go around and sand it so that this surface is all nice and flush. So I'll do that and then we'll see how it fits in our main body there. I've done a little bit of cleanup work on this to get the barrel part to fit in, and it does fit nicely. I want to make sure it's nice and loose in there because I'm going to be painting this, and that added layer of paint will cause a little more friction. It will also maybe get scratched on the way in, and I want to avoid that. So that's a good fit right there. I've just been using this piece of sandpaper wrapped around a metal pipe to go in and sand the inside there, and it's looking all right. The tools I like to use to do some more of the fine detail work, I mentioned my needle files here. These are so good for this type of work. I also have a card. They call it a card. Let's see, it says file card. But it's a wire brush to clean the 3D printing filament dust out of your files. After a while, these will get gummed up and they are not as effective. So you want to clean them every once in a while. One of the next steps will be filling in this area here. I think this was on the support material, and these layers just didn't get laid down really cleanly, but we can fix that. That's not a problem. The thing is, I could just start sanding this, but I want to avoid, some of these are kind of stringy, and I want to avoid just ripping these all out. So instead, I'm gonna hit this with a little bit of super glue. That way any of the stringy bits of filament there will stay in place when I start to sand it. So I just have some normal super glue here. I'm just gonna kind of lay it over all the loose parts. And I wanna make sure it kind of soaks down in there because I want it to grab any parts that are loose. And then I don't really need all of that to stay on there, so I'm just gonna wipe it down a little bit with a paper towel. Then I'll use my super glue accelerant to kick it all off, and it'll cure right away, and I can start sanding it. There we go, and well, that's just a part of my hand now. But that's convenient, because I've always wanted to have a paper towel on demand. Yeah! Now I've got this nice hard sort of shell there, and I can start sanding it a little bit. Now I'm not going to sand this all the way down to smooth because there will be some gaps that we have to fill, but this will at least get us partway there. And I'm just using a 220 grit sandpaper here. I find with this printer and with this filament, that's a good place to start. With a nicer print, you could start at 400, or with a print that really needs a lot of work, you could do like 100 grit. Knock back all those layer lines. These parts here that are still a little shiny are low spots, so I want to fill those in, and I've got my spot putty here. This is an air drying spot putty. This is the acryl green, and it's great. It cures really fast. It's a little toxic, so you definitely want to use this in a well-ventilated area, and try not to huff it while you're working with it. I'm just using my X-Acto knife here to spread it out and fill in those low spots. This may take a couple passes, so what I'll do is spread some on here, and then I'll let it dry while I go and work on a different part. Then I can come back and sand this and see if it needs any more filling. This stuff's really great, but I tend to make sure I only use it on gaps that are at most about 1/16 of an inch wide or deep. It is air drying, it's not catalyzed, so if you put a big old goober on there, then it's never gonna dry. While I've got my spot putty out, there's a couple more spots I want to do a little bit of filling on. That'll be hard to see. In fact, the barrel covers a lot of that, but there's a little bit of some gaps in there that I'm going to fill. Also, this front spot here, you can see there's a bit of a texture. Again, the barrel is going to cover most of that, but I might as well fill this little part here. This stuff just needs about a half an hour to dry, and then I can come back with my sandpaper and smooth it all out. It's time to really get down to the nitty gritty and sand. Like I said before, I'm starting with a 220 grit, and I know that works really well with this ABS at this layer height to get it down to remove all those layer lines. And you'll notice I haven't sprayed this with any primer or filler primer. I found that it really isn't necessary with these prints. However, your results may vary. As an example, here is my Blade Runner blaster, and you can see that this blue is not primed. I just sanded and sanded and sanded until the layer lines were gone, and then I kept going up the grits until it was nice and shiny. This looks like an injection molded part, but it's not. It came off the same printer as this piece. So all you need is a little bit of elbow grease and a whole lot of sandpaper, and you can turn your prints into something nice and shiny. Now these parts don't need to be that shiny. I'm gonna paint them. I got these parts really shiny for mold making, but I'm not gonna make a mold of this. So I think maybe 200 or 400 grit is probably gonna be enough. But for now, I'm just going over all of my parts with this 220 to get rid of the layer lines. I do prefer printing with ABS, but I have a really good setup for it. My Ultimaker prints it really well. The glass bed is perfect for it, and I built an enclosure for it. Of course, I know not everyone prints in ABS, and I bet you've got a favorite filament that you like to use. I know PLA is just the easiest. It's the easiest to print with anyway, but I've seen a lot of people now using things like PETG or some sort of mix between all of those. And I wonder what your favorite filament to print with is, and most importantly, why. So, hey, let me know in the comments if you have a favorite filament to print with, and please tell me why. I'd love to see a lot of the different types of filaments that are being used. I've got this part to where I want it, mostly just knocking back the layer lines. I will have to go to a higher grit, probably a 400 on this. But before I do that, I want to get the rest of the pieces to this state. Starting with these little knob button looking thingies. I printed these separately. They actually go in these circles here, but I wanted to make sure that the edge between them was nice and defined. So I printed them separately, and there's still a lot of the brim around that. And I'm going to leave that on there so that I can sand these nice and smooth and have a little something to grip them by. This is 220, but this is also 220. It's just this rubbery sandpaper, which is sometimes a little bit easier to get around stuff like this. So I can sand these down just like that. That's pretty good. And then to cut them out, I'm actually going to use my leather hole punch. It should be just about the right size to cut that out, just like that. Now I just have to poke that out. I'm going to use a stick and boop. Ta-da! I can't believe I found that. It landed right here. Anyway, there's a tiny little round bit that will eventually get glued in right there. And that actually looks like it'll work out. I'm gonna sand this part first though. So these little guys I'm gonna put somewhere safe so I don't lose them. My air drying spot putty is all dry, which is great. That means I can start sanding. And this stuff sands really nicely. I'm gonna start with some 220 grit sandpaper. And the goal here is to sand most of this filler off and only leave what's down in the crevices that's filling the gaps that we had in our 3D print. So as I sand this away, you can see spots like right there where the filler is left behind, and that's what we want. That's filling a gap right there. So I'll go over this whole thing, and we'll see if we have to do any additional filling. Something else to keep in mind, this is the kind of dust you really don't want to breathe. Not that you want to breathe any dust, but a dust mask is definitely mandatory for this kind of work. You don't want to breathe it in. Oh, I should put mine on. This part right here was clearly very low compared to everything else since there's a lot of filler in there. And it's kind of hard to see. We'll prime this at some point to make it more obvious, but there are still some low spots that are gonna need a little bit more filling. So before I spend a ton of time sanding this whole thing, I'm just gonna put a little bit more filler on some of these low spots. Actually, I can show. We'll do a visual test real quick here. I'll just cover this whole area in red Sharpie, and then I'm gonna sand it. So I'm sanding off all the high spots. Those red spots are still low, and we need to fill them. This whole piece is printed in this orientation. That means that this curve right here, as the slope gets more and more flat, the layers become more apparent. So up here, it's fairly smooth, but down here, I can even see like a millimeter gap right there. So to really nail that part, I've got my 100 grit sandpaper to try and chew away at that. If I can't quite get through all those layers, I'll go get my spot putty. But for now, this part just needs to get a little bit of extra love. Hey, that worked out okay. So the 100 grit was able to get rid of those layer lines there. And now I'm just gonna go in with my 220, smooth that up, and then clear up the really fine layer lines right there. It's been about another hour and our second layer of filler is dry. So I can get that all sanded down. And hopefully this is the last bit of filling we're gonna need to do. I also filled the bottom of this part. The stair stepping on this was a little egregious, so gave it a good rough up and filling, and then I can set it all flat. Looks like I've pretty much got everything. We'll know when we prime it. Now I can take my 220 and go over all the rest of the parts, get rid of the last bits of the layer lines. Just about ready to do our first pass of priming, but I think it's time to install these tiny detail parts. I left them off until now just to make it easier to sand around them, but they're all gonna be the same color. I think I might as well put them in now. Just like that. Boop, boop, like that. This is just a little bit of super glue. Should hold it in nicely. And then this fella can go right down like that. A little bit of squeeze out there, so I'll just wipe that up with some paper towel a little bit. And then I have my activator here, so I can give it a touch. There we go. Those parts are all secured, and now I can set everything up for priming. These two larger parts here, I'm gonna put on some skewers, put a little tape on here so that it'll be snug. Like that. It's not snug. Try again. Set that in there, so this is nice and snug. I can paint it like so, and then I can set it down in here. I've got these other smaller parts here. I'm not gonna glue them on yet, mostly because they will be a different color. It'll be easier to paint them that color before attaching them. To prime them though, we do wanna get them primed. Got some double stick tape, and I'm gonna lay that down on a piece of wood. So that's sticky. I can take these parts, like the back of this won't be seen, so that can get stuck down there. And these little parts can go down the same. The trigger can stick down like that. And then this guy, that's where it's gonna attach. That won't get painted. I can stick that down. I can snick that down, snick, bub. Now I can flail this about and spray paint it, and it won't go flying anywhere. While I'm working on that painting, I want to take a moment to thank our patrons. It's because of you and your support that we get to work in this shop every day and support a team of 4 people. If you would like to jump in on the fun and join the rest of our patrons, head on over to patreon.com/punishedprops to get access to weekly behind the scenes vlogs, early access to our build videos, and extra credit videos for every one of our build videos. Thank you so much for the support. Let's get back to painting. It is now a day later. Decided to give this plenty of time to dry. The primer is all nice and dry. And now we can start doing our final pass of cleanup. The primer also helps us see any spots we might have missed when we were doing our filling and sanding. Now that we've got that primer there, it's very clear. You can see scratches left behind from our 220 grit sandpaper. So this whole surface on everything needs to get sanded again with 400 grit sandpaper. We can also see, much to my dismay, spots that we missed with our filler putty. So it's much more clear now that this is a low spot. So I've got my filler putty right here, and I can clean it up a little bit. Just fill that little spot in. So we can let that dry while we are sanding and working on our other parts, and then in about half an hour we should be able to sand that nice and smooth. Similar thing going on up here. You can still see some of the relics of the 3D printing. So we need to decide how much work we want to put into that. We could either try and sand it down more smooth, or we can try and fill it in. In this case, I think I could probably sand that a little bit more smooth. This area I'm not too worried about. We have another part that's gonna cover most of that, but I'll probably give that a good once over as well. The cool thing about this is, hopefully, if I sand all the gray away, that means that it is nice and flat. I may have to prime this again just to be able to see. Since I had put some filler in there, it's kind of hard to see where the low spots are now. Definitely feels good. This spot, there's a little bit of gray right there. That spot needs a little bit of filling. Again, I could just sand that until it's smooth, but at some point you start changing the shape of this whole thing, and we don't want to do that. So I'll just fill that with a little bit of my filler putty here. There we go, and we'll get to sanding everything else. Everything so far is sanded down to this 320 grit. My 400 grit paper was a little too fine. It was getting all gummed up. This stuff is awesome, so that's kind of where I have it now. Did a little more filling and sanding so all of the little blemishes are covered. The last thing I want to do before the last round of priming is a little bit of buffing with this scouring pad. This is a fairly high grit scouring pad, and this will just help get that last little buff in there. And the surface is nice. I'm kind of looking at it in the light so I can see the shine, see if I've missed anything horrendous. Actually, I had a thought too, because I wear my wedding ring, but at this point, if this scratches the surface, that would be a super bummer, so I'm gonna set it aside for now. Just don't tell my wife.
I'm filming. filming you.
She knows! Anyway, after this, we'll get everything set up on our little priming or painting station here, and we'll give it 1 or 2 good coats of a finer model primer, the Tamiya model primers. We'll actually take that stuff and throw it in a cup of hot water, not super hot, but just we'll warm it up a little bit. That helps the spray be a little more misty when it comes out the front of the nozzle, as groundskeeper Willie would say. Yeah, it just helps have a nice finer finish, which we want to make sure we get for our paint job. One more coat in like 10 minutes and then we'll give it some good time to dry. I went and put 2 light coats of primer on all the parts, gave them about an hour to dry. Still don't want to get my greasy mitts all over them, but I can do my base coat of color now. And you can see I've got these pieces here and I've got some over here. These are all going to get painted silver. So I have my Tamiya silver chrome paint here loaded up in the airbrush. And then these ones are going to get the gunmetal. This way I keep the pieces apart. I can paint them different colors and then I'll put them together later and I don't have to do any masking. So let's fire up the old airbrush, put down some paint. Good to go. Blurb. We got our base coat of paint done on all the parts, nice and dry. I also went in and added a clear coat over everything just to protect it a little bit. We do have to do just a little bit of masking, and that clear coat will help make sure we don't lift any of that base paint up. What we gotta do on this handle is this part right here. So I'm gonna mask off everything except for the white, and then we'll airbrush that on. I've got the base layer of masking tape down, but instead of just trying to strategically lay it down, I put down more than I needed. I'm gonna cut away what I don't need. So I wanna try and figure out that line right there. Let's see, that is 45 millimeters up. So I'll do the same thing on the other side. Right there. Then those need to meet like that. And I'll just clean it up a little bit. Now I'm gonna cut this away, and when I cut into the masking tape, it will cut into the model a little bit, but that's okay. That'll be the edge of the paint. You'll never notice the cut. You wanna use a really, really sharp brand new blade if you can to do this kind of work. You don't wanna have to claw at it a whole bunch of times. Then this just ends right at that groove right there, just like that. And the rest of this tape is extra and can be removed. So now everything that's exposed will be painted white. I have some white paint loaded up in my airbrush here. I also masked off some of these smaller parts that just need a little kiss of white on some of these parts here. Gave this only a few minutes to dry. I used a hair dryer to help it along the way. I can touch the bottom here and see that paint is not coming off, which is good. If you're gonna do a test like that, touch it somewhere that you're not gonna see a lot. Little life tip for you there. This is one of my favorite parts, pulling off the masking tape. Oh, tell me that isn't just the most satisfying thing ever. Yeah. Here, let's do it again on this side. Come with me, won't you? Oh, that's nice. Gentle, careful. There we go. Hey, that looks pretty great. I think that's all the masking I have to do for this. But Bill, there's more white decals and stuff. Oh, I'll show you how that's gonna go. And it doesn't involve paint. Instead of white paint, I have some white adhesive back vinyl, and this is gonna get cut out on my vinyl cutter. All the logos, symbols, and text for this piece were designed in Inkscape, so I made a vector file and I can feed that to my vinyl cutter to cut all of them out of this vinyl. Then I can peel this off the backing and carefully apply it to my prop. And the vinyl is going to be a permanent part. So instead of making a stencil and painting it, we're going to take the positive out of here and lay it down on the piece. To line this part up, I'm going to put some masking tape down to give me an edge to follow. This way I know it'll be parallel with the line right there. And I could put some transfer tape on there to move these pieces over, but I think with these simpler line parts, I can probably just do it by hand, like that. Needs to start way up, and that's kind of where that goes. I think that's just gonna kind of hang out over the white right there. I think that looks pretty cool. And then this will wrap around and meet up with the other side, and then we'll trim them together. But for now, I can just remove that. And that looks really nice and clean. This can get tucked away. There's a little extra bit there I can remove. So these two pieces need to meet up. I will cut one of them carefully. There we go. Get rid of that extra part there. And then I'll just line this one up over it, just like that. And then I'll trim the middle where the meat. Take that off. There we go. And then I'm just gonna press all of these down into the surface with a Q-tip. Make sure that everything is nice and secure. Yeah. Oh, that looks clean. I like that. I am doing some weeding. So all of the, I don't know what they call it. What do they call the little bits in the middle of like O's and stuff? I can't remember what that's called, but those little bits are getting pulled out now while I get ready to lay all these parts down. It's so much easier to try and do this now than later when you're trying to put it down on the part. This is kind of tedious, but I actually find it satisfying. All right, so I got the middles out. The outsides can be tricky with these really little bits. They may want to go because the adhesive is still kind of hanging out there between the parts, so I'm just cautiously and slowly removing them. You stay there. Hey, Brett. I can smell you. It's time to put the tiny little decals on our part, and to do that, I've got some transfer tape. This is just a low tack tape. It's designed to stick well enough to pull the piece or the vinyl up, but not so much that it won't let it stick back down. So just like that, I'm able to lift it up, and then I can kind of get everything aimed, press it down, and hopefully when I peel off the transfer tape, everything stays. Hey, look at that. And then I can just press that into the surface, and voila, it's done. Let's see, some text goes next to that, lock barrel right there. So I get another piece of tape here. Just press that down. Oh, not all the text came with it. Try again. Really press into that. Come on, R. Both of you. There we go, and then that can go over here. Press that down really well. Ooh, there we go. Nice. I guess I'll just repeat that over the rest of the gun. Ah! Circle, no. Boop. I did another layer of clear coat on this bad boy to protect everything we've done so far, and hopefully that helps our vinyl stick down and not move anywhere. It's finally time for the assembly. This is when I'm very happy that I kept all these parts separate until now. This part can go in here, and there's a flat spot on the top where this part can go, and that'll get glued down, and I can do that now because once that's glued down, this won't be able to come out. So I'm happy with everything, and I can glue that in place. I want to sand the surfaces that are gonna get glued. I got these little sanding twigs that are so useful, especially this part that was painted. I'm just gonna scratch away some of the paint, get back down to the 3D printed plastic a bit, just so that it's got something to grab onto. And I grab my glue. We're just gonna do super glue for some of these smaller parts. A little bit of glue, we won't need much. A little bit of glue like that. And then on the back of this piece, I'm gonna hit it with my super glue accelerant. Boop. Now when it gets set down, it'll cure instantly. So we wanna make sure that we get it right on the first try. Just like that. So it can't go out anymore, but that's okay. That's where we want that to chill when we put all of this together. Before we put the main body together, we have some more smaller parts here that we can glue down. Just like before, we want to make sure any of the surfaces, this has already been sanded, but this spot right here, we want to make sure we scratch away a lot of the paint. I don't need to sand all of it. Just enough though, so that the glue has a little something to grab onto. Now instead of spraying on and getting it everywhere, I'm going to set this down and position it where it needs to go. Make sure it's all nice and straight. And then I have a little bottle of accelerant and I can just go and put a tiny bit there and a tiny bit here, and that'll seep under and cure all that glue. I've designed these parts to have this hole that runs through both sides, and I have this steel rod that I picked up at the hardware store that will connect the two. That'll make this assembly much more rigid, and it gives the prop a little bit of weight, which is nice. This is also the last step of the assembly, and to glue it up, I need a little bit more time than super glue can afford. So I've got some epoxy. This stuff cures in like 3 minutes. So once we're ready to go, we gotta jump to it. And I think I'm ready to go. Let's do a dry assembly. That goes in there, that goes in there, and then that goes in there, like that. And then I have a clamp ready. My jaws have tape on them so I don't ding up my paint job, and I can clamp it together. Let's get to mixing. There's a little bit of squeeze out, so I want to carefully remove that. All right, that's looking pretty good. So I'm just gonna leave it for a good 5-10 minutes until it's cured up. In the movie prop, it looks like there's a real LED here. I didn't plan for wiring or anything, but I do have a real LED. I wanna install it and just have that nice plastic dome. It won't light up, but it'll still look pretty cool. This, I don't need all of this though, so I think I'm just gonna trim that on the bandsaw. Just get a little dome. I got these really cool pliers for holding round things out the front of the plier, like that. Pliers? Just need the tiniest amount of glue, and then I can drop that piece in there, right in, straight in there. And there we go. Little dab of accelerant, whoop, right on. My epoxy is nice and cured, and I should be able to take the clamp off with no problem. So far, so good. This is great. It's holding together really well. There's just one last thing to do. It's far too clean. It's time to weather it just a little bit. For the weathering, I'm gonna do some oil paints. I really like how these look on mechanical things. So I have these water mixable oil paints, and you can actually thin them a tiny bit with water, which is super, super useful to get a nice thin layer on here. And I'm just gonna douse everything and then wipe it all down. I am so stoked for how this turned out. Looks so cool with all the weathering. I love how the oil paints kind of stain the white so it's not that stark brand new white. It's got that world-worn feel. And I really dig the little bit of rub and buff I added to just some of the edges to make it look like it's been around the block a little bit. This thing is so cool. That is the full build for our pistol from Oblivion, the Tom Cruise Oblivion. They didn't have this in Elder Scrolls. This was crazy fun. Like I said, it was a project for our PropTarts Secret Santa. We'll have a link to the PropTart group down below. I hope you learned a little bit about 3D modeling, and I hope you give it a shot yourself. The software is free, the resources are free. We did a little bit of 3D modeling in this video, but if you want to see the entire process, we have a second full video on the 3D modeling over on our second channel. And of course, if you're looking for a little bit more of a beginner 3D modeling project, check out the Han Solo dice video we did. It's literally a cube with some symbols on the side of it. You should be able to knock that out in no time. Even if you don't have a 3D printer, it's well worth learning even just some basic 3D modeling techniques. If you want to get stuff printed but you don't have a printer, you could team up with a buddy, see if there's a local makerspace that'll print it for you, or send your files out to get printed at a place like Ponoco or Shapeways. Oh, also libraries have 3D printers now. Check those out. That's going to do it for this build. Thanks so much for hanging out with me in the shop today. I do hope you give this a shot yourself. It's super, super fun. I want to take a chance to thank our patrons for all of the support. It's because of you that we get to work in this wonderful workshop on goofy, fun projects like this. If you want to join in on the fun, head on over to patreon.com/punishedprops to get access to behind-the-scenes vlogs, early access on our build videos, and extra credit videos for those build videos. That's all I've got for you. Thanks so much. I'll see you in the next build. I'm actually going to use my leather hole punch. I'm gonna try to anyway. This is a low-tack tape that's designed to never get cut with scissors. Okay, these scissors are super dull. Now I know that. Hold on. This is going great, you guys. All right, let's get to sanding. I'll just glue that back on there and no one will ever know that fell off.